My name is Elena Ward, and the day my father's will was read, my brother smiled at me like grief had finally made me easy to beat. That smile stayed with me almost as much as my father's letter, not because it was cruel, because it was familiar. My brother Ryan had always smiled that way whenever he thought the room belonged to him. When we were children, he smiled like that after breaking something and waiting for me to explain it. As adults, he smiled like that when he arrived late to crises I had already managed and still found a way to speak as though he had been carrying the burden all along. That was Ryan's particular gift. He could stand in a house built by someone else's labor and still look like the owner. I was 36 when our father died. Ryan was 40, older by 4 years, louder by 20. Our father, Thomas Ward, had been a contractor before he retired, the kind of man who trusted his hands, his land, and any paper important enough to deserve signatures in blue ink. He was not sentimental in obvious ways. He did not cry publicly. He did not say, "I love you," every time he meant it. He paid attention. That was how he loved people. And that was why, by the time he got sick, he knew exactly which of his children performed devotion and which one practiced it. I was the daughter who did the unglamorous things. I handled medication schedules, insurance calls, tax notices, roof repairs, nurse coordination, Dad's blood work appointments, the paperwork on the lake cabin, the contractor disputes Ryan meant to look at. Ryan visited beautifully. He brought food he didn't cook, promised improvements he didn't finance, made moving speeches in hospital hallways just before disappearing when forms needed to be signed or bills needed to be compared line by line. Family noticed. They just didn't say it out loud. Because families, especially older ones, are often built around preserving the comfort of the least reliable man in the room. The will reading was held 11 days after the funeral. Gray Thursday. Low winter sky. A lawyer's office in the older part of downtown, with darkwood shelves, muted carpet, brass lamps, and the hush of a place where bad news had learned to dress respectfully. I arrived first. That mattered to me. I didn't want to rush into the room, carrying adrenaline. I wanted to see it before everyone else filled it with performance. The office smelled faintly of paper, dust, and coffee. Martin Feld, my father's attorney, greeted me with the kind of serious warmth you only get from someone who has watched your family too long to romanticize it. "Elena," he said softly, "you're early." I wanted to be. He nodded once, and there was something in that nod that made me think of the phone call 6 months before, when he had asked me to come by my father's house after one of Dad's medical consultations. Not because anything was urgent, because Dad had wanted to go over final structures. At the time, I thought he meant practical details. Power of attorney language, property sequencing, transfer timing. He had meant that. He had also meant something else. I sat down near the window and folded my gloves carefully in my lap. Then Ryan arrived. Late, of course. He entered with his wife, Kelly, and that particular energy men like him bring into legal spaces when they expect good news to already be leaning their direction. Navy blazer, white shirt open at the throat, just enough to suggest he was grieving, but still handsome. The smile, always the smile. "Elena," he said, kissing my cheek like we were meeting at brunch instead of our father's will reading. "You doing okay?" That question was such a perfect Ryan sentence. Thoughtful enough to sound kind. Empty enough to require nothing. "I'm here," I said. Kelly sat beside him and crossed her legs. She wore cream cashmere and a watch my father had once paid to repair after Ryan forgot it at his house for 6 months. She smiled at me with polished sympathy, the kind women wear when they think they're already safe and want to seem gracious about it. My Aunt Deborah came in next, carrying tissues, sorrow, and 30 years of family politics hidden behind soft, church lady phrasing. 2 cousins arrived after her. One nodded at me. The other avoided eye contact. Martin Feld took a seat at the head of the table and opened the file. I remember looking at his hands. Steady, careful, not dramatic. That calmed me, because if you are about to watch greed bloom inside your family, it helps when at least one person in the room still believes in sequence. Martin began with the ordinary provisions: the charitable donation to the county trade school, Dad's tools to a former apprentice, a modest cash gift to Aunt Deborah, personal effects. Then the bigger pieces began. The primary residence, Martin read, passes to Ryan Ward. Ryan leaned back. Not much, just enough. Enough to signal victory. Kelly's smile widened by half a degree. I kept my face still. Dad's truck also went to Ryan. His watch. A reserve business account. A larger direct cash distribution. Then a much smaller amount to me. For one suspended second, the room rearranged itself around my brother's satisfaction. He looked at me the way boys do after winning games. They rig themselves. Well, he said softly, but not softly enough. I guess Dad knew who was supposed to carry the family name. Nobody breathed. That sentence was not about inheritance. It was about humiliation, about public ranking, about making sure the room saw him receiving more and me receiving less. About turning our father's death into one final stage on which he could be golden and I could be practical. I looked at him, then at Martin, and I said the 5 words my father had been waiting years to let me use. Open the second envelope, Martin. Everything changed. Ryan frowned first, because confusion is always the first emotion entitled people experience when a script stops following them. What second envelope? Martin looked up at me over his glasses. Are you certain? Yes. My aunt stopped dabbing at her eyes. Kelly's spine straightened. One of my cousins leaned forward. Ryan laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. What is this? Martin did not answer him. He reached beneath the primary file and withdrew a second sealed envelope. Cream paper, blue ink, my father's handwriting. Across the front, clearly written, to be opened only if Ryan interrupts, humiliates, or challenges Elena before the first reading is complete. The color drained from Ryan's face so fast it almost looked theatrical. Almost. But this was one of the few emotions in his life he had not prepared cosmetically. He looked at me as if I had somehow created the envelope by wanting it hard enough. I did not smile. That would have cheapened it. Martin broke the seal and unfolded the pages inside. The second envelope contained a codicil. Simple, legal, surgical. If Ryan attempted to assert entitlement, interfere with the reading, or publicly diminish my standing during the inheritance proceedings, then the controlling assets of the estate were to shift immediately into the Ward Family Preservation Trust, with me named sole acting trustee. The room stopped feeling like family after that. It became architecture, words, structures, consequences. Martin kept reading. The family home, the controlling deed protections, the easement rights attached to the lake cabin, the reserve contractor fund, the managed development corridor parcel, the long-term mineral lease participation rights, all under trust management. Mine. Not because Dad had loved Ryan less, because Dad had trusted me more. Ryan stood so fast his chair scraped across the carpet. This is insane. Martin did not even blink. He continued reading as though Ryan were weather. Then he opened the handwritten letter folded behind the codicil. "Elena," Ryan said, voice rising, "what did you do?" I turned my head slowly and met his eyes. "Nothing," I said. "You did exactly what he expected." Martin read my father's note aloud. "Ryan, if you are hearing this version, then you once again mistook confidence for character. Elena has spent years protecting what you perform ownership over. She knows the value of things that cannot be bragged about at dinner. She knows what it takes to keep this family from being sold in pieces." No one moved. I looked down at the polished wood of the table, because if I had looked at Ryan then, I might have enjoyed it too visibly. And enjoyment would have ruined the moment, because what I felt was not delight. It was recognition. My father had seen the same thing I had seen for years. He had simply waited to put it where Ryan could not charm around it. There is a kind of silence that only exists after truth enters a family room carrying legal authority. That was the silence after Martin finished reading. Aunt Deborah whispered, "Thomas wouldn't," then stopped, because of course he would. He had. Ryan remained standing, looking less like a grieving son and more like a man who had discovered too late that his charm had been audited. "This was manipulation," he said. She got to him. Martin folded the papers carefully. "Mr. Ward, the codicil was signed 8 months ago in my presence and witnessed properly." Ryan looked at me again. "You turned him against me." That sentence would have hurt me once, when I was younger, when I still believed family would rather accuse a woman of plotting than admit a man behaved predictably. But by 36 I knew better. "No," I said. "You just finally met the version of Dad that wrote things down." Kelly put a hand on Ryan's sleeve. "Sit down." He shook her off. That detail mattered too, because the more power slips from people like Ryan, the rougher they become with the people closest to them. "What exactly am I supposed to get now?" he snapped. Martin glanced down. The original sentimental provisions still stand. The watch, the truck, personal effects, a reduced cash distribution subject to trust review. Ryan laughed bitterly. Sentimental provisions. Now he sounded like himself. Not heartbroken, not betrayed, reduced. And there it was, the real wound. It wasn't that Dad had protected the estate. It was that Dad had recognized Ryan as the kind of son who could be trusted with symbols, but not stewardship. That was what destroyed him. Not losing money, being seen accurately. The reading ended with procedural instructions, trust administration, review periods, asset sequencing. I remember almost none of it after the line about the development corridor parcel, because that was when I realized my father's revenge was deeper than humiliation. He had not just moved assets. He had moved leverage. Most people in that room thought the house and the cabin were sentimental holdings. Dad knew better. He had spent decades reading land the way other men read markets. The easement rights attached to the cabin, the access parcel near the county development line, the reserve contractor account tied to staged improvements. He had left the bones of future value in the hands of the child he trusted not to chew through them for applause. When the meeting adjourned, Ryan followed me out into the hallway. The office door closed behind us with a heavy, soft click. "Elena!" His voice had changed. Lower now. Tighter. Less public. I kept walking toward the elevator. He caught up beside me. "Don't do this." I pressed the elevator button. "Do what?" "You know this isn't what Dad really wanted." I turned to look at him then. The fluorescent hallway light made everything too honest. "It's exactly what he wanted," I said. "That's why he wrote it down." He clenched his jaw. He was sick. "So, you used that." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because the accusation was so inevitable it felt scripted. "Ryan," I said. Dad was not confused. He was tired. "Those are not the same thing." He looked around the empty hallway as though hunting for a witness sympathetic enough to restore him. "You can't hold the whole family hostage." The elevator opened. I stepped inside and said no. "I'm just holding the keys." Then the doors closed between us. That might have been enough for a smaller story. It wasn't enough for Ryan. The phone calls started before I made it home. Kelly first. "Elena, I think emotions are high right now." "Then this is a bad time to negotiate," I said. She inhaled sharply. "I'm not negotiating." I looked out the car window at wet streets and winter storefronts. "Then why are you calling before the body flowers have even died?" She hung up. Aunt Deborah called next. Her approach was softer, which made it more dangerous. "Sweetheart, you know your father loved your brother too." "Yes." "And grief can make people say things they don't mean." Ryan meant every word. A pause. Then, with all the pained sincerity of a woman trying to preserve a broken family image with somebody else's spine, she said, "You don't want to divide everyone." That almost made me angry. Almost. Because there are sentences women hear their whole lives that are not really sentences. They are obedience traps. Don't divide everyone. Keep the peace. Be the bigger person. You know how he is. Don't make this uglier. What those sentences always mean is this: absorb the damage quietly so the wrong person can stay comfortable. I did not say that to my aunt. I only said, Dad already made the decision. I'm not changing it to protect Ryan from meeting himself. Then I ended the call. By evening, cousins were texting. A family friend asked if there had been some kind of misunderstanding. One of Ryan's oldest drinking buddies had the nerve to leave a voicemail saying, "He's pretty torn up, Len." Len, as if childhood nicknames could reverse legal structures. I ignored them all. Then I took off my coat, set my bag on the kitchen table, and spread the estate documents out in order. Trust papers, deed attachments, cabin survey, access parcel maps, reserve fund accounts, environmental notes. I made tea and started reading. That is the difference between people who inherit value and people who preserve it. One celebrates, the other studies. By midnight, 3 things were clear. First, the family home was protected by deed language that prevented forced sale without trustee authorization. Second, the lake cabin was not just a cabin. It sat adjacent to a corridor the county had been quietly evaluating for expansion and utility access. Third, the reserve contractor fund wasn't a casual business leftover. It was attached to staged maintenance structures designed to keep both properties from becoming distressed enough for opportunistic sale. Dad had not simply rearranged affection into paperwork. He had laid a trap for irresponsibility. and Ryan had stepped on it before the reading was even finished. At 12:47 a.m., I found the letter Dad had left me separately. Not the note Martin read aloud. A different one, folded between the trust schedules. I opened it. Elena, you have a habit of thinking responsibility is not visible because no one applauds it while it is happening. But I saw it. Every appointment you made, every bill you checked, every contractor you corrected after your brother hired confidence instead of competence. If I leave this in your hands, it is because I know you will hate the power and use it correctly anyway. That line hit harder than the codicil, because that was the deepest truth in the whole story. I did hate the power, not because I was weak, because I knew exactly what family power costs women when they use it openly. It makes you the villain in stories people would rather tell about male disappointment. I sat at the table for a long time after that, letter in hand, and let the grief finally come somewhere clean and private where nobody could turn it into weakness. Then I folded the letter, put it back into the file, and kept reading. Because if Ryan came for the trust, and he would, I wanted to know every corner of it before he touched the first door. For the next 2 weeks, I became what my father had always trusted me to be. Meticulous. I met with Martin Feld twice. I reviewed the trust administration sequence. I confirmed title authority. I spoke with the county assessor's office about the development corridor rumors. I had the family home insurance updated. I requested maintenance files on the cabin. I called the mineral lease contact number buried at the bottom of an appendix Ryan had probably never even noticed existed. The more I read, the clearer my father's design became. Ryan had been given things he could hold in his hands and show to other people. The truck, the watch, selected cash, sentimental symbols. I had been given the structures that actually determined survival, not because my father was cruel, because he knew which child would turn land into a memory and which would turn it into a drunken dinner story before losing it to debt. That was when the real emotional weight of the inheritance settled over me. I had not won. I had been appointed. That is heavier than winning. 3 weeks after the reading, the call came. A local real estate broker named Charlotte Hanley introduced herself with a polite voice and a strange question. "Ms. Ward," she said, "I'm calling because there appears to be a title discrepancy on a property your brother is attempting to show." My entire body went still. What property? The cabin. Of course he would start there, because the cabin looked easiest to liquidate. Scenic, emotional, something a buyer could romanticize while ignoring the paperwork attached to the ground beneath it. Who authorized the listing? I asked. She hesitated. Your brother represented himself as principal family successor. I closed my eyes for 1 second. I'm on my way. The drive out to the cabin took 50 minutes. Gray roads, bare trees, patches of old snow in shaded ditches. I remember gripping the steering wheel hard enough to make my knuckles ache. Not because I was afraid, because I was furious in a cold, exact way. The cabin had been the one place my father allowed himself softness. He rebuilt the porch twice because he liked sitting there in silence after fishing. He kept my mother's old thermos in the kitchen cabinet 15 years after she died. Every summer, no matter what had gone wrong in the city or the family, he mowed that grass himself. And Ryan was trying to flip it like a used watch. When I arrived, there was a silver sedan in the driveway, and Ryan standing on the porch with a woman in a camel coat. Charlotte Hanley, not just a broker, as it turned out. Former judge. Semi-retired. Local enough to know a title lie when it walked toward her in a borrowed grin. Ryan saw me and froze. That moment fed me for weeks. He was still handsome, still well-dressed, still carrying himself like a man who expected old patterns to save him. But there was something new now, a flicker behind the eyes. Not fear yet, but the beginning of not being believed. Charlotte turned toward me. "Ms. Ward." I held up the trust papers. "Yes." Ryan recovered quickly. "Family misunderstanding." Charlotte looked between us. "The kind that creates fraudulent listing exposure." He laughed too fast. "No one said fraudulent." I climbed the porch steps one at a time. "Take the key out of the door, Ryan." He stared at me. Then he said, low enough for only us to hear, "You really are enjoying this?" I looked at him for a long moment. "No," I said. "I'm protecting what you tried to steal." Charlotte stepped back, wisely giving us room without leaving. Ryan lowered his voice further. "This is Dad's cabin." "Yes." "And you're willing to drag me through legal hell over it?" That one almost got me. Not because of the threat, because of the audacity. He had been willing to sell family property he no longer controlled to a stranger behind my back before probate dust had even fully settled. And somehow I was the one creating ugliness by refusing to let him. I held the papers out where Charlotte could see the trust authority block. "Mr. Feld will be filing restriction language today," I said. "Any attempted transfer activity from this point forward becomes documentary evidence." Ryan's face changed. He looked at Charlotte. Charlotte looked back at him with a kind of cool judicial contempt that made me like her immediately. "I think we're done here," she said. She left 10 minutes later. Ryan stayed on the porch after her car disappeared. We stood in winter air, so cold I could see both our breath. Then he said, "You think Dad loved you more because he made you trustee?" There it was, the real wound finally spoken. Not money, not property, love. I felt something in me soften then, but not enough to save him. "No," I said quietly. "I think he trusted me more. Those are not the same thing." He looked like I had slapped him. Maybe I had. With the truth. Martin filed the emergency title restriction that afternoon. Ryan's broker withdrew within hours. Kelly moved out within the month. Aunt Deborah stopped calling as often. Cousins who had wanted peace became mysteriously unavailable when peace turned out to require paperwork instead of pressure. And then in early spring, the final piece fell into place. The county approved phase one of the development corridor expansion. The parcel behind the cabin, the one Ryan had barely known existed, became strategically valuable overnight. The trust's value did not just increase. It transformed. I was at the kitchen table when the notification came through. Morning light. Coffee cooling. 3 separate emails arriving within 12 minutes. Assessment update. Development notice. Mineral participation estimate revision. I read them twice. Then called Martin. He answered on the first ring. "You saw it." "Yes." He let out a slow breath. "Your father knew this was likely. Not guaranteed, but likely." I leaned back in my chair, and suddenly I understood the full shape of my father's revenge. He had not simply protected the estate from my brother's ego. He had arranged it so that the moment Ryan behaved exactly as predicted, the assets most vulnerable to his recklessness would pass into the one set of hands that would not waste them right before they became truly powerful. That is not luck. That is judgment with a long horizon. Ryan called me that night. No greeting. Just did he know? I looked out the kitchen window at the yard behind the family home, at the fence post my father had once repaired himself because Ryan never showed up that Saturday either. Yes, I said. A long silence. Then, so he really left everything to you? I closed my eyes for a moment. No, that was still not the truth. He left everything, I said, to the person he believed would keep it alive. He laughed once, bitter and wounded, and still somehow trying to turn pain into style. That's your version. No, I said. That was his. He hung up. I stood there for a while after the line went dead. Not triumphant. Not exactly sad either. Just finished. Because that was the final difference between Ryan and me. He thought inheritance was proof of love. Dad knew it was proof of trust. And trust is much harder to fake. A week later, I drove out to the cabin alone. The lake was still half cold. The porch boards creaked under my boots. Inside, everything smelled the same. Pine, dust, old coffee, old summers. I found my mother's thermos exactly where Dad had always kept it. I sat on the porch steps and let the silence come. Then I said out loud, because there was no one left to hear it except the land, and perhaps him if the dead still bothered to listen. You knew him? Of course he did. That was the whole story. My father had known his son. He had known his daughter. He had known exactly how greed would show itself when grief loosened the floorboards. He had known which child would confuse sentiment with ownership, and which one would hate power enough to use it carefully. Ryan said I didn't deserve Dad's inheritance. Then I instructed the lawyer to open the second envelope. And my father, from beyond the grave, did what he had spent a lifetime doing when Ryan mistook swagger for structure. He corrected the plans.